Detroit has buried most of the names from its crack era. Some died in the street, some died in prison, and some disappeared into addiction and were never seen again. One woman from that era is still here, sitting for interviews and telling the story herself. Her name is Delrhonda Hood, and the streets called her Big 50. This is the story of how a woman managed to outlast people who started higher in the game than she ever did. The city that made her before the legend. There was a city in collapse, and understanding what that collapse looked like is the only way the rest of the story makes sense. By the time Delrhonda Hood was old enough to read the streets around her, Detroit had already lost more than 60% of its peak population. The plants were closing, the tax base was shrinking, white residents had moved to the suburbs, and the city services that remained were stretched too thin to reach the neighborhoods that needed them most. Whole blocks had gone dark, and into that vacuum walked the dealers. In the late 1970s, Young Boys Incorporated rose first, run by Dwayne Wonderful Wayne Davis and Milton Butch Jones. Federal agents would later describe the operation as having a military-like organization chart with strict hierarchies and brutal enforcement, and the gang specifically used minors as runners because juvenile penalties were lighter than adult ones. At its peak, YBI allegedly earned nearly $500 million annually, which gave a generation of Detroit teenagers a working economic model they could see on every corner. When YBI fell, the Chambers brothers stepped into the same space, but with a different approach. The Chambers brothers had migrated from rural Arkansas, and they ran their crack operation like a corporation, offering 2-for-1 deals and discount coupons to attract repeat buyers. They recruited young men from the South and put them inside houses that operated 24 hours a day, which meant the supply never paused and the customer pipeline never broke. The municipal response, under Mayor Coleman Young, combined federal funding with aggressive policing, but the application of that aggression was not evenly distributed. The Detroit Police Department launched a unit called the No Crack Crew, which is alleged to have targeted black neighborhoods more harshly while suburban areas received education funding instead of raids. Inside the department itself, corruption and drug abuse undermined enforcement, and the gap between what the police were able to do and what the dealers were willing to do widened with every season. That was the environment Delrhonda Hood was born into on October 28, 1965. Industry gone, major employers gone, a police force compromised, and a drug economy filling every empty space the legitimate one had abandoned. She grew up on the east side of Detroit. Her father worked for one of the big three automakers, and her mother eventually took a job as a nursing assistant, which placed the household at the working class edge of a city losing both ends of its economic structure. The marriage itself was not stable. In her own telling, her father was a serial cheater. Her mother fought him. Her mother sometimes shot at him, and the marriage broke when Delrhonda was around 8 years old. She stayed with her father, which set the pattern of her early life, proximity to the parent who took fewer rules seriously. The early signs that something in her was sharper than the children around her appeared before she was out of elementary school. She was expelled from kindergarten for hitting another child with a wooden chair, and she once brought rolled marijuana to school and handed it to her teacher, claiming her parents had smoked it the night before. Those incidents were already on the record by the time she was 12, when a neighborhood dispute over lemonade stand money turned into the story that would follow her for the rest of her life. In her own words recounted on the No Jumper podcast, she described the day clearly. "My grandma had always taught us to pick up something. Somebody come after you. You better hit him with the stick. You better, hit him with the brick or something like that. So my first reaction is to pick the stick up, and I jugged an eye right, and I brought it home. The other girl, by Hood's account, lost the eye permanently, and the family had to be compensated. Hood's parents paid for a glass eye replacement, and the incident did not result in school expulsion, only because it happened off school grounds. The public record on this is thin. The girl's family is unnamed in coverage. No juvenile court file from 1977 has surfaced, but Hood tells the story the same way every time, which is part of why it has held up over decades of retellings. By age 15, she was pregnant, and that single fact closed off the path most teenagers use to climb out of a city like the one Detroit had become. She did not want the child, but her mother insisted she carry the pregnancy to term, and the boy was born and largely raised by his grandmother. He would later call his grandmother Mama and his mother Ma, which captures the shape of the household more cleanly than any narrative could. School ended somewhere around the 8th grade after she and a friend slapped a teacher named Miss Chapman on both sides of the head and were expelled. She was now a teenage mother with no diploma, no income, and no plan, in a city that had already cut off most of the legitimate options that might have absorbed her. The economic shape of Detroit pointed in one direction. There was no manufacturing job waiting. There was no path back into school, and the household income her father had once provided was gone. What was waiting was the underground economy, and it was paying. There was a woman from her neighborhood named Gloria, and she became, by Hood's own account, the model. Gloria wore thigh-high boots, drove fancy cars, and carried herself with the kind of presence that filled a block. Gloria was, as Hood would later learn, a high-end prostitute and a functional cocaine user. As a child, Hood would tell Gloria she wanted to grow up to be like her, and Gloria would tell her no. Hood did not listen. The pattern of women like Gloria mattered for a specific reason. In the Detroit of that decade, the women with visible money were not coming from offices, and they were not coming from the auto plants, where most female hires had been in clerical work that had already been automated or eliminated. They were coming from sex work, from boyfriends with drug money, or from running their own small operations in the spaces the men did not bother to occupy. To a teenager with no diploma and a child to raise, those women were the only working economic model on display, which made the underground economy the natural next step rather than the desperate one. Her grandmother's instructions to put weapons in the bushes along her walking route were not paranoia either. They were the response of a woman raising children in a city where, by the late 1970s, the public services that once protected the walk to school were no longer reliable. Detroit's school system was contracting, the teachers were aging out, and the students who would have once gone into apprenticeships at the plants were instead being absorbed into the corner economy. The collapse was not abstract for her. It was visible at every block boundary. She was not the first woman to step into the trade, but she would eventually be one of the very few to walk back out of it. The rise of Big 50. If the city handed her the conditions, her first paying client gave her the template, and that template arrived through a doorway most teenagers would never have walked through. In her own account, she was around 17 when she met him, a white man in the suburbs with a hot tub, money, and specific tastes that involved being beaten with sticks and dripped with hot wax. He paid her each visit and told her to open the bottom drawer and take whatever cash she wanted, and she was too young to know what she was looking at. She was also, in her own telling, too young to recognize the brown paper bags in his refrigerator, which she would later believe had been heroin. That arrangement lasted until it didn't, but by the time it ended, she had already met other men through him at after-hours clubs, including Greek businessmen and older men with money who wanted discretion and access. She no longer needed an introduction, and the second business began the moment she realized she could bring other women along instead of going alone. The men paid more for choices, and she handled the bookings and took a percentage. By her own account, prices in that era ran $4,000 to $5,000 per session. She kept a house, kept rotation, kept records in her head, and gave the operation a structure that most of her peers working alone never bothered to build. Her closest collaborator at the time was a white woman she remembers as Brenda, a dancer who would do bachelor parties and baby showers, and who, when other women in the house could not handle a particular client request, was the one Hood called in. Brenda's role inside the house captures the way the operation actually worked. Not a stable of interchangeable women, but a small network of specialists who served different niches in the same client base. She has spoken on Mojo's State of Mind about how the operation looked from the inside. I had my address on that 22138. Oh, what's happening? Now I got a good memory, I always had that memory, always as a little kid, always 21338. Oh, West Hampton suspected crack out some more. Up, I'm like, that you got the crack man on this, like a up in here. Chinese hoes, Mexican visions, black as black yellows. I got them all, baby. The neighborhood block club tried to shut the house down by printing flyers that listed the address and complained of suspected drug activity, and her response captures the kind of operator she had become. She walked up to one of the women distributing the flyers, took one for herself, and read her own address back to her. The drug side of the business overlapped with the madam side from the start, because the same men with the money for premium sessions were often the men with the money to buy product. She has named, in interviews, the kind of clientele who came in. Men with cash from gambling, from cocaine, from the YBI generation that had aged into independent dealing. By her own account, this was the same period when Detroit's gambling and crack cocaine economies were peaking, and a generation of street operators were carrying that kind of cash on a regular night out. She was also, separately, beginning to move drugs, and the man she has named as her direct teacher in that side of the business was Skinny Squarely. He gave her, by her own statements on Mojo's State of Mind, the foundation of how to handle product, how to handle people, and how to operate without fear. The lesson she has repeated most often from that period is the simplest one. There is no fear in this game, and as a woman in it, you cannot afford to show any. She has described needing that exact lesson in real time. There was a night, by her own account, when men came to rob her at home with her children in the car. She has said she shot one of them as he attempted to climb a tree on the side of her house, that she did not kill him, and that she let his friends pick him up and take him away as a message. There is no police report attached to that incident in any public coverage, only her account. The drug operation grew alongside the brothel rather than replacing it, and that diversification was not accidental. She kept stash spots, used runners, and stayed deliberately quieter than the men in her circle, because the men in her circle were the ones drawing federal attention while she was still small enough to slip past it. She also, by her own account, was robbing other dealers in this period. She would walk into smaller crack houses where the workers knew her by association, claim the principal had sent her to collect, and walk out with the cash. I would go over there and rob my little dude crack house for the money with no gun, just as they give me the money, so I would go over there and rob my little dude crack house for the money with no gun, just as they give it to me. Wow, yeah, they gave it to me. Inside Detroit's network of independent operators in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Big 50 was a known name, and her movement between strip clubs, hustler circles, and the homes of women working under her gave her a presence that crossed segments of the city most operators stayed inside. The pattern her interviews lay out, when held against sociological research on women in the drug market, matches what researchers have repeatedly documented about how women operate inside that economy. Indoors, with regular sources, using non-cash transactions more often than men, sometimes trading sex or favors for protection or product. Her business model and its mechanics was not unusual. What was unusual was the scale she operated at without a male partner running her supply. Other women associated with the Detroit drug era entered the trade through the same door, through a relationship with a male leader. The most prominent example is Tonisa Welch, who became known as the First Lady of BMF through her relationship with Terry Flannery, managed money inside the operation, and served prison time on charges tied to that role. Welch's documented position is verifiable. Hood's claim is different, and she has been clear about the distinction. I dealt with drug deals and everybody think, oh, she's BMF. I'm not BMF. I don't have BMF, rolling my ass, back, neck, or nothing. I got money with lots of in the game, because I'ma say no. Lots of right, so I don't label myself as this in this game related, or this, I don't know what they are. Because you got money would be a man. If you got money with everybody with any crew, it is that I can get money. By the early 1990s, she had reached a position the city recognized, and the visible markers of that position were everywhere. She was buying cars and wearing furs and putting her children in private bus services rather than the regular public school yellow buses. The neighborhood economy she was operating inside was at its peak. The crack market had matured, and the federal government's pressure had not yet shifted from the major organizations toward independent operators. She was inside a window that, in retrospect, was already starting to close. She had also accumulated by then every ingredient of the cases that would eventually put her behind bars. The houses, the product, the names in the phone, the money trails that no one in that economy bothered to clean, and the associates who would eventually be picked up and asked to choose between their own freedom and hers. She did not yet know which of them would choose which way, and neither did they. That is how the system worked for everyone inside it. People kept moving until the moment came when they could no longer move, and Detroit was about to enter the half of the decade that decided which operators would still be standing on the other side of it. Inside the system she ran was not improvised, and the specifics of how it worked from the inside are what separate her from the dozens of operators in her own neighborhood who did not last as long. The house was the center of it. There were women inside, available on rotation, and a phone line that rang. Men called and asked who was working. She told them who was available and named a price, and the men came to her address rather than meeting in cars or hotels. A deliberate choice that gave her control over the environment every transaction took place in. Inside the house, the women wore lingerie, and Hood walked among them in the same when clients came in to choose. By her account, she had every kind of woman in rotation, and Arabic clients had specific requests that she filled, while Greek clients paid premium for specific acts. And when a request was beyond what one woman could handle, Brenda was called in. Pricing was tiered, and a session in the late 1980s and early 1990s could cost a man $4,000 to $5,000 by her account. She has compared it directly to today's economy and noted that the going rate in 2023 had collapsed to a fraction of what it once was. BR up killing herself ain't that crazy. Yeah, peace, I love her, but. So like the thing that stands out to me when you're saying these numbers is that if you were to go to any one of the host strolls around La, I'm pretty sure you're a chick for like $50. That was some You know what? Back then it was 4 and 5,000. You'll get from a player, okay? Even the ones with the funky ass feet. The hygiene rules of the house were her rules, and the wealthy regular client whose feet smelled is the example she reaches for most often. She made him put his shoes outside, soak his feet in bleach water, and only then was he allowed to see one of the women. She set the terms and enforced them, which is not how most madame operations of that era functioned. Cash discipline was the other side of the same instinct. When a male associate paid her in stacks of bills and the count came out too high, she returned the difference, and that practice was, by her telling, why the men in her network respected her, even though she was a woman running a parallel enterprise. She would not pocket what was not hers, and that single habit kept her name clean inside circles that could have crushed her over a missing 20. The decision to present herself as honest about money inside an entirely dishonest economy was strategic. The men in Detroit's independent operator circles, by the late 1980s, had been burned repeatedly by partners who skimmed and disappeared, and the few people who had reputations for clean counts became the ones everybody wanted to do business with. She has said this directly in interviews, that the men around her dealt with her because she was real about money, and that being real about money was what gave her access to the connections that kept her in product. While the brothel handled the higher margin clients, the drug houses ran on a different rhythm. Same address pattern, workers inside, a constant flow of customers, and by the late 1980s, she was selling crack and heroin on a retail and mid-level basis. The security routine wrapped around both sides of the operation. She watched her doors, watched her cars, and when men came to rob her, she met them with a gun. Her children grew up inside houses where weapons were within arm's reach. What she has not produced in any interview is the kind of organizational structure that the major Detroit gangs had on paper. There is no chain of lieutenants she names by title, no fixed crew with a name, no enforcement arm. The Chambers brothers had a corporate hierarchy. YBI had a military-like organization chart, and BMF would later have an Atlanta logistics network and a money laundering operation. Her operation, by every internal description she has offered, was self-contained. One woman at the top, a handful of women under her doing sex work, a handful of male runners moving product, and a reputation that stood in for the enforcement other operations needed to staff. The label that has attached itself to her, Queenpin, does not, when measured against the verifiable record, fit the way the public uses it. The major Detroit drug organizations of her era handled hundreds of kilograms and employed hundreds of workers, and none of the federal indictments from that period list Delrhonda Hood as a principal. Where she appears in court records, she appears on state-level drug possession and distribution charges, plus fraud charges in the 2000s. The documentation of multi-state distribution is not there. The enforcement crew operating under her name is not there. What there is, instead, is the persistence of a woman who ran a small, profitable, multi-revenue operation across 2 illegal markets at the same time for years, in a city where most operators of any kind were either incarcerated, killed, or addicted within a fraction of that span. The diversification is what kept the operation running, and when the prostitution side aged out, her women got older, the clientele wanted younger, and she did not want to keep refreshing the rotation. She leaned harder into the drug side. When the drug side felt too dangerous, she added scams. The scam she ran was the largest single financial enterprise of her career. By her own account, in partnership with an Armenian friend she calls Valerie, since deceased, she identified a vulnerability in the federal tax filing system. She has been deliberately vague in interviews about exact mechanics, but she has said the scheme involved taxpayer identification numbers harvested from public sources, including the Yellow Pages, where business tax IDs were once printed alongside listings. She did something almost no street-level operator does before committing a crime. She paid a lawyer in advance. By her account, she walked into the office of a Detroit attorney named Cornelius Pitts with $1,000 cash for a consultation, then returned with $35,000 as a retainer. She told him what she was about to do and asked him whether he would represent her when, not if, the indictment came. He told her it might come in 6 months, in a year, or in 5, and she told him to take the money and be ready. The crew she built around the scam was, by her account, around 200 people, which is consistent with how tax fraud operations of that era functioned. A small core of organizers and a wide ring of participants who filed in cash. The federal government would later allege the total take was $8.5 million. Hood has said she and Valerie cleared roughly $2 million each. The collapse came the way it always comes in operations of that size. Someone got picked up, someone talked, and then someone else talked.
And the Fed said you guys made, don't quote me wrong,
8.5 million.
8.5 million.
Well, that's when everybody get paid. See, they some lying and people be so scared because they come with the name, the alphabet boys, FBI. So everybody be scared because they got their name, but they got a job to do.
Right.
You know, that's their job, is to come and do what they got to do, and I respect their job.
She and Valerie were charged. By her own account, she cooperated only to the extent of admitting her own actions, and she did not name anyone else. The case ended with what she has described as 6 months in a halfway house and 3 years of probation. For an $8.5 million fraud case, that landing is unusually soft, and it points to either a strong defense, a willingness on her side to plead, or an offer she has not described publicly. She credits the lawyer she had paid in advance, but the reality may be more complicated than the version she tells. What is documented, beyond her own narrative, is that around this period and the years following, she was repeatedly arrested, repeatedly charged, and repeatedly returned to street life. Public summaries indicate 5 felony convictions on her record, and she is, by federal classification, a habitual offender. Her longest single sentence was 3 years, with most bids running 2 and 3 at a time, in and out of prison, in and out of halfway houses, in and out of supervision. The federal government's frustration with her, by her telling, was that she kept slipping between the cracks, and during one sentencing hearing, the judge attempted to throw out her plea agreement and impose a 10-year sentence before her attorney produced documentation that her cap had been negotiated at 3. The rhythm of her operation became the rhythm of her entire adult life: risk, profit, indictment, plea, time, release, restart. And that rhythm continued for almost 2 decades. The asymmetry of who absorbed the legal weight is part of why her name became the one that survived. She took the pressure that, in a different operation, would have been distributed across a male leadership structure. There was no one above her to absorb the fall for her. And the system, in that sense, treated her exactly the way it treated the male principals of larger organizations. It just took longer to find her because she was smaller, quieter, and harder to map. The consequences. The damage was always there. It just took years to surface, and when it did, it surfaced everywhere at once. She has talked about being shot, and the story, as she tells it across interviews, and as it appears in coverage from Detroit's Metro Times, is that someone she trusted shot her in the face. The bullet shattered her jaw. Doctors told her she might never speak normally again, and she spent months in recovery. The scar on her face today is, in her own framing, the physical record of the betrayal. The specific details are not in any public police record that has been surfaced. No named suspect, no court case attached, only her account and the visible scar. What that period did to her trust shows in the way she now talks. She does not name names she has not already cleared, and she does not lay out the chain of who introduced who. She has said in interviews she has thousands of numbers in her phone and would deny knowing any of them under interrogation. The rule of the game she came up in was simple. You knew what you signed up for, and you did the time when it came. The friends she lost in that period are scattered through her interviews as casual mentions, and the names that recur tell the cost more clearly than any general statement could. Brenda, the white woman she had known for years, the one she had gone to baby showers with, the one who could handle the highest paying clients, killed herself. Brenda had been seeing a black man, had been suffering, and had begun collecting prescription sleeping pills over the course of 4 months without taking any of them. Then she took all of them at once. She left a small address book behind, with Big 50's name highlighted in tape, having told her parents that Big 50 would be the one to explain. When Hood eventually learned the full history, the pattern became visible. Brenda's brother had also killed himself. Brenda's father had also killed himself. And Brenda was the third of a sequence that had been moving through the family for years. Valerie, her partner in the tax fraud, also died, though Hood does not describe the cause in detail. She says only that Valerie is gone and that she still carries the grief. The men she had come up around moved through prison or graves on the same timeline. She has mentioned, in passing, the kind of figures who used to come through her house at the height of the era. Men with the YBI generation's money, men associated with best friends, men from the Cherry Cruise, and most of them are no longer free or no longer alive. She has also been honest about the personal use that destroyed others around her, and at points herself. As the era wore on, she lost cars, lost houses, and watched her income drain, and the wealth that had been the public proof of her status disappeared in stretches of the 1990s. The most documented period of her decline ended with her last federal-style sentence. By her account, federal agents raided her home in 2011, and she and her oldest son were facing court appearances together. To keep her son from going to prison, she took the weight herself. She asked the prosecutor for permission to remain free for a single weekend in May 2013 so she could attend her daughter's high school prom, and the prosecutor refused, citing her pattern of sliding through the cracks. She turned herself in the following Monday and came home in 2015. That bid was the one that broke her, by her own admission. The state sentence she served was materially worse than anything she had done in federal facilities, and she has described the conditions in detail. Food marked on the bag is not for human consumption, discolored water that peeled skin, 40 days in solitary confinement during a fight she got pulled into, 3-minute showers in shackles. The contrast between federal and state systems is not unique to her account. Federal facilities, particularly minimum security camps, are funded at higher per-inmate rates with cleaner facilities and more programming. State prisons, especially in jurisdictions with strained budgets, are where the harder time is served. For a habitual offender accustomed to federal sentences, dropping into the state system at her age was a sharper transition than the time itself, and it stayed with her after release as part of the reason she has not returned to the trade. While the state time stripped her down, an earlier federal sentence had given her one of the more unusual chapters in her story. The stretch when she crossed paths with Martha Stewart at the Alderson Federal Prison Camp in West Virginia, the facility nicknamed Camp Cupcake. Stewart walked into a line of inmates waiting to give her shower shoes, deodorant, and other commissary items, and was, by Hood's account, prepared to fight Bernie Madoff's daughter at one point during her time there. She was scared of nobody, really. She them DC come through that. M was not scared. Okay, she about to bury up. We always talk about this. Me and my girls are laugh like she GNA'd this up from DC. Really, she's GNA Bernie ass up. You saw Martha Stewart on the verge of getting in a fight. Hood has said Stewart cooked, picking crab apples from the prison grounds and turning them into pies, and that Stewart taught the women around her how to take eggs out of the kitchen by hiding them in their bras. Stewart got caught. Hood has been unsparing about the gap between Stewart's celebrity status and what Stewart actually did inside, noting that Stewart received no special privileges, worked in horticulture, and did the same chores everyone else did. Stewart, in Hood's telling, came out of that system having absorbed a network of women who would later receive employment from her on release. Across that period, the federal time, the state time, the long stretches in solitary, the consequences became impossible to outrun. She has talked openly about contracting an MRSA infection in prison that nearly killed her, and about a moment alone in a hospital cell where she made a promise. If she lived, she would leave the streets. When she came home from her final bid, the only people calling her were the people who still wanted her in the trade. The legitimate world had not made room, and the illegitimate world had not forgotten her number. She chose at that point not to answer. The cost of staying in had been laid out for her over decades. Brenda, Valerie, the shooting, the prison terms, the MRSA, the years she had missed with her children, her father who has since died, her mother still in Detroit and still requiring her presence. She had spent 30-some years building a name inside an economy that was now telling her, through every channel, that the time was over. The federal pressure that had taken down her contemporaries had moved on to a new generation. The Chambers brothers had been prosecuted. YBI was a memory, and the Black Mafia family had been dismantled by a 2005 federal indictment. The men she had once shared a city with were either dead, still serving time, or coming home decades older into a Detroit that no longer had a place for them. She was alive, free, and watching the next generation of Detroit hustlers move into a game she no longer recognized. And that, more than the prison time itself, was the part she has been clearest about. The game she came up in had rules. The new game, in her telling, has none. The kids don't give a, kids walk around with AKs and Draco and stuff down the clothes, right? With silencers and beans and switches. And they don't give a, in our era, they didn't do that type of, they was more making money. We need to make the money, these kids, more on who got the tightest pants on. The world that had made her was already most of the way gone, and the world replacing it had no use for the woman she had been. That gap is where the second half of her life began. The practical reality of returning home in 2015 was that the half-life of a Detroit street reputation, even at her level, was longer than the federal sentences that had been handed out to her contemporaries. The names from her era still circulated, but the houses she had once run had long since been sold or demolished. The women she had worked with were mostly gone, and the men who would have once been her customers were either deceased or in their 60s, drawing on whatever was left of the money they had moved. The city itself had changed in ways that did not favor a return. By the time of her release, the post-2008 contraction had pushed Detroit's population to its lowest point in nearly a century. The neighborhoods that had once supported a 24-hour drug economy were half vacant. The houses that had once been stash spots had been condemned and torn down, and the rules of who got prosecuted for what had shifted in ways that made her habitual offender status a liability she could not absorb a sixth time. Returning to the trade in any meaningful capacity would have required a different operation in a different city and a willingness to accept a sentence measured in decades rather than years. What remains? The legend kept going after she stopped feeding it, and the platform that carried it forward was one she had no role in building. In the years after her last release in 2015, the crack-era nostalgia industry on the internet was looking for survivors. YouTube channels, Vlad TV, No Jumper, Mojo State of Mind, American Gangster, built audiences on long-form interviews with former hustlers, and most of the big names from Detroit were either dead or still incarcerated. Big 50 was reachable, articulate, and willing to talk, and she gave the interviews. The clips moved fast across the platforms. The stick and eye story, the bleach water and the foot-soaking client, the Martha Stewart anecdotes, the car on the tree shooting, the lawyer paid in advance, and each one became its own currency, pushing her name into a market she had not previously accessed. By 2021, BET Plus released a film loosely based on her life, with the role played by Remy Ma, a rapper who had served her own federal time. The film leaned into the Queenpin framing. The marketing copy positioned Hood as a Detroit equivalent to Griselda Blanco, and the label stuck. That label is where the documented record and the popular record permanently diverge. The divergence is not random. The crack-era nostalgia industry rewards specific narrative shapes, and the Queenpin label fits a slot the platforms have been trying to fill for years. Audiences raised on Griselda Power and the Black Mafia Family series are looking for a female counterpart with the same operational scale, and the absence of one in the verifiable historical record creates a gap that gets filled by whoever's willing to occupy it. Hood is willing. The available evidence does not place Delrhonda Hood at the head of a multi-state drug network. There are no federal indictments listing her as a principal in any of Detroit's major organizations, no DEA seizures attached to her name in the public record, and no money laundering cases tied to her of the type that defined BMF, where the federal government documented hundreds of millions in laundered proceeds and 2,500 kilograms of cocaine moving through the operation each month at its peak. What the record does support is something quieter. A woman who ran a brothel and at least one drug house in Detroit's east side for an extended period, who organized a federal tax fraud scheme that the government valued at $8.5 million, who carries 5 felony convictions, who is classified as a habitual offender, and who survived a shooting, a near-fatal infection, and multiple prison sentences over the course of 3 decades. The cartel leader version of the Queenpin label does not match that record. What it does match is closer to what University of Michigan researchers describe as the post-YBI ecosystem, a network of independent operators who filled the space left when the major organizations were dismantled, and who often outlasted those organizations precisely because they were too small to attract federal attention. What set her apart from most operators in that ecosystem was that she was a woman, and that she lived. Sociological research on women in the drug market has consistently found that female operators tend to be undercounted, under-investigated, and under-prosecuted relative to men. Investigators presume men are at the top, and women are presumed to be girlfriends, runners, or accessories. That presumption made it harder for Hood to be detected as a principal during her active years, and easier, after the fact, for her to claim a role larger than what the record can confirm. Both effects are real, and they explain a lot of the gap between her telling and the paper trail. The question of how she outlasted the people around her has, when reconstructed from what is documented, a set of consistent answers that compound on each other. She stayed local, rather than pushing outside her neighborhood the way the major organizations did, which kept the federal radar off her. She diversified across sex work, drug sales, and tax fraud, 3 different revenue streams with 3 different risk profiles, so that pressure on one did not collapse the others. By her own account, she did not cooperate across multiple federal and state cases, which preserved her standing in the streets after each release. She also read the room as the era changed, pulling back from the dope game when fentanyl began replacing heroin and prescription pills, and her stated reason, that she did not want to kill anyone, lined up with a market shift that made the old margins newly lethal. She also had a lawyer ready before each major move. The retainer paid to Cornelius Pitts before the tax fraud case is the most visible example, but it indicates a discipline most street-level operators did not have. She treated legal costs as overhead rather than as a crisis expense, and the soft landing she received in case after case suggests that the discipline paid out. And she had children to come home to. The thought of leaving them was, by her own telling, eventually what stopped her from accepting one more lick. Whether or not that is the whole truth, it is consistent across her telling, and it lines up with her current advocacy work for incarcerated women and girls. What remains today is a woman in her 60s living in Detroit. Her father died in recent years. Her mother is still alive and still in the city, and her oldest son spent time in the system before working a long stretch in the auto industry between bids. Her daughter graduated. Despite her mother not being able to attend the prom, she runs a 501c3, does coat drives for the homeless, advocates for prison reform, buys candy in bulk for Halloween and gives it out in her neighborhood, and hosts a podcast. She is one of the very few people from her generation of the Detroit street economy who can do any of that. Most of her contemporaries cannot. They are dead, still incarcerated, or came home so old and so broken that no platform reached for them. The story she tells now is, in part, a memorial for the ones who did not make it out. Brenda, Valerie, the men whose names she will not say, and the Detroit she came up in, which collapsed in stages and produced an entire generation of women whose roles in the underground economy were never documented at all. Tonisa Welch is one of the very few others who did get documented, and only because of her marriage to a Flannery brother and her conviction for money laundering inside the federal BMF case. The list is short. Most of the women who worked the drug economy of that era are not in any record. They were couriers, stash house managers, and partners, the people the press did not write about and the federal government did not chase, and they are gone. Hood's survival is what makes her visible, and the legend is what survival looks like when it is broadcast on YouTube. The two have stopped being the same thing. The record, when measured against the legend, suggests something quieter than the title Queenpin, a woman who built a small, disciplined, multi-revenue operation and ran it for decades in a city designed to consume people, who took 5 felony convictions and walked back out from each one, and who learned somewhere around the 3rd or 4th sentence that the only person who could afford to keep paying the cost of the streets was someone willing to die there. She has been clear, in her own telling, that she does not say she will never go back. She has said the chips can get low, that the thought crosses her mind, and that she does not promise the future. What she has done is leave on her own terms, after most of the people she knew did not. The Detroit she came up in is gone. The federal investigations that took down the organizations she once stood near are closed. The film about her has aired. The interviews have multiplied, and the myth has hardened into something that no longer entirely belongs to her. The woman is still here, still in the city, still telling the story, still adjusting it, and still surviving the consequences of decisions she made when the city looked nothing like it does now. The question the record leaves unanswered is whether the legend will outlast her, or whether the version of her story that gets remembered will be the one with the documents attached, the smaller, harder, more verifiable version of a woman who simply did not stop walking out of rooms her contemporaries never made it out of. That answer is not yet on the record. What is on the record is that on the morning this report was written, she was still alive, still in Detroit, and still talking. In an era that buried almost everyone like her, that by itself is the part of the story that does not need a label.